And Sherwin joins us now live from New York to talk more about this bill. Sherwin, good to see you as always. So quite a long way to go, as you were just detailing, for this bill in terms of these proposed sanctions possibly becoming a reality. But let's put into context its significance at this stage.
Well, its significance in a sense that South Africa is being discussed by members of the lower house of the United States Congress. But let me give you some historical context here. A similar bill authored by Representative John James of Michigan, a similar South Africa-USA review bill did pass the House of Representatives in May last year. At the same time, South Africa was going through the national elections. That bill was then passed by the Republican majority in the House of Representatives. And because it was passed by the full House as opposed to just the committee, as is the instance here, it then logically moves to the Senate. But of course, Chuck Schumer was the leader of the Democratic-led Senate and did not take up the legislation. And when that Congress ended at the end of last year, before the elections that elected Donald Trump and new leadership to the House and Senate, that bill then died when that Congress ended. So you have Ronnie Jackson, the Republican from Texas, who has reintroduced a review bill. It is now passed through committee. The question is, when will it now go to the full House of 435 members? Will it pass that House, right? We don't know for sure, but Republicans have the majority. There's a lot of Democratic support for this review legislation. So say it passes the House, maybe in September when the House comes back from recess, maybe a bit later. So that gives you a little bit of a timeline. It then has to be taken up by the upper House, the Senate, where a deliberative process will ensue. And then, of course, you have to, Tembekile, reach the 60 vote threshold. In terms of the 100 senators that vote there, you will need 60 votes to pass the legislation. Republicans currently have 53 votes. Democrats have about 47. The question is, are they then able to get enough bipartisan support for that legislation to pass the 60 vote threshold? It will then, if it does that, go to President Trump's desk, where you know that there has been interaction at the highest levels, in May in particular, when President Ramaphosa visited the White House. And what does one then say about the continued relations, be it through the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, the trade representative in the United States, be that through Ronald Lamola's Department of International Relations and the Secretary of State here, Marco Rubio? Those interactions, we are told, have resumed. There is, of course, the G20 handover that will happen in November. So there are other interactions despite this that must also be included in this basket. I will just add one more thing. South Africa, of course, still does not have a permanent representative, an ambassador that has replaced Ibrahim Rasool after his expulsion in March of this year. And so the question then becomes, who is representing South Africa here in terms of lobbying members of Congress, be that the House of Representatives now or the Senate, in terms of this legislation? That's kind of the role of the ambassador. That will be the role of South African diplomats. Who is leading that charge based here in the United States? And as you well know, Tembekile, President Ramaphosa has not confirmed a replacement for Ibrahim Rasool as yet.
So all of that quite interesting, Sherwin, as you say, no, at least public-facing, if you will, lobbying being done by the South African government at this stage, or even the ANC itself, because its leaders, if these sanctions come to pass, would be directly affected. This Ronnie Jackson, who brought this before the legislators, himself a Republican, known to have Trump leanings, correct? But can we deduce then from him sponsoring these possible sanctions or the bill itself that his views are an accurate representation of perhaps the feeling from the US President Donald Trump about possibly enforcing sanctions?
Well, he himself says that Ronnie Jackson is, of course, the former White House personal doctor of the president before he ran for Congress. And so there is a personal relationship there. He was endorsed by President Trump when he ran for that seat, that congressional seat in Texas. And let me perhaps just preface here what the prescriptions are in terms of the legislation. What does this legislation do in terms of moving forward? It essentially calls on the president, in consultation with various members of his cabinet and agencies that play a substantial role in United States relations with South Africa, to conduct a comprehensive review of the bilateral relationship and make that review available to Congress. And here's the kicker, right, in terms of the question around sanctions. it gives the president, if enacted, remember we're not at the enacting point yet, but once this is signed into law, it then gives the president 120 days after the enactment to provide a list of senior South African government officials and ANC leaders that the president determines to have engaged in corruption or human rights abuses that could then meet the criteria for the imposition of sanctions under something called the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, which allows the United States to use domestic legislation to sanction foreign entities and individuals. But with respect to that démarche, the president must then provide a detailed explanation describing the conduct forming the basis for that person's inclusion on the list, the expected timeline for sanctions as described in paragraph 1 to be imposed on such a person, and if the president does not intend to impose sanctions with respect to those individuals, a detailed justification as to why that is not the case. So it doesn't necessarily mean that because the legislation passed both houses and is signed into law, there will be sanctions. There will have to be some criteria through a process led by the president and cabinet officials that present that to the Congress in terms of this legislation. But as I say, direct contact between President Ramaphosa and President Trump could make this entire process moot. But those conversations, at what level it's happening, we don't know all the details around that yet.
And Sherwin, will touch base with you through the coming hours, coming days, possibly